The war in Europe had finally fallen silent, but the echoes of destruction still haunted every broken wall. It was May 1945. Munich lay in ruins, the air thick with smoke and dust. A squad of American soldiers trudged through the debris of the once grand Berghof estate, their boots crunching over shattered glass and burned paper. They weren't looking for gold or weapons this time. They were looking for answers. The heavy oak doors of a private study groaned open under their push, revealing a room that seemed untouched by the chaos outside. The scent of old wood and charred paper hung in the air. Sunlight slipped through cracked windows, falling across shelves that lined every wall, shelves filled with books, thousands of them, leather-bound, fragile, perfectly arranged. At first, the soldiers thought it was just another stash of looted culture, perhaps stolen from the libraries of conquered nations. But as they drew closer, their flashlights caught something strange. Inside, many of the books were handwritten notes, underlined sketches and margins scrawled with initials that froze them in place. A.H., Hitler's handwriting. They stood in stunned silence, realizing what they had stumbled upon wasn't just a collection of books. It was a window into the mind of the man who had set the world on fire. Every spine on those shelves might hold the words that fueled his madness, the ideas that shaped his empire. What could America possibly uncover within the pages that had inspired history's most feared dictator? What kind of man did his own reading reveal? The soldiers didn't yet know it, but they had just opened the door, not to a room, but to the darkest library in human history. The world was still reeling from the shock of Hitler's death. His body, discovered deep in the Führerbunker, had been burned beyond recognition, but the ripples of his collapse spread far beyond Berlin. Across Europe, Allied forces were now in a frantic race, one not fought with bullets or tanks, but with maps, manifests, and intuition. The mission was simple in words, but monumental in scale. Find everything Hitler left behind before it disappeared forever. In the chaos of surrender, entire trainloads of stolen art, gold, and documents were vanishing into the black markets of a broken continent. Priceless works from museums, archives, and private collections, plundered during 6 years of occupation, were hidden in salt mines, castles, and abandoned factories. The Allies feared not only the loss of treasure, but the loss of truth. Among them was a small, specialized unit few had heard of, the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program, or simply the Monuments Men. They were not typical soldiers. Many had been professors, museum curators, or art historians before the war. Their mission? To preserve the soul of civilization from the ashes of its darkest moment. But as they combed through Germany, they discovered something that went beyond the boundaries of art. In the weeks following the fall of Munich, intelligence. Officers uncovered records hinting at a vast collection of personal items belonging to Hitler. Items he had moved between his residences, from the Chancellery in Berlin to the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps, and even a hidden estate near Linz. Most assumed these would be war plans or propaganda archives, but when the first crates were opened, their contents silenced even the most hardened soldiers. Books, thousands upon thousands of them. At first glance, it looked like any wealthy man's private library. Leather-bound classics, philosophy and poetry. But the longer the Monuments Men spent cataloguing them, the more unsettling the discovery became. These weren't just random volumes. Each book had been personally selected, catalogued, and often annotated by Hitler himself. Some bore his embossed eagle and swastika seal, others his nameplate Adolf Hitler München. Many were still dusted with ash from the bombings that had nearly obliterated his world. As the collection grew, so did its mystery. Reports flowed in from across the defeated Reich. More shipments found in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. More boxes unearthed in salt mines near Berchtesgaden. More volumes hidden beneath collapsed bunkers. When the numbers were tallied, archivists estimated over 16,000 books were once part of Hitler's personal library. But what unsettled everyone was not the quantity, it was the content. Inside those books were fingerprints of a mind at war with itself. Philosophy, mythology, pseudoscience, military history, some titles banned even under his own regime. It was as if the Führer had tried to build a fortress of ideas around his delusion. Captain Robert K. Posey, one of the Monuments men, later recalled how his team worked late into the nights, surrounded by open crates and crumbling pages. "It was eerie," he said. "We were holding what had once passed through his hands, what had shaped his thoughts. It felt radioactive." The more they uncovered, the more questions arose. What had Hitler sought in these texts? Was he looking for justification, for proof of destiny? Or were these books simply trophies of a man desperate to appear learned? One officer described the experience as reading his ghost through the margins. In some of the works, Hitler had underlined passages about power, race, and empire. In others, he marked words about fate and divine right. There were volumes of Nietzsche's "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," with notations beside lines about the Übermensch. There were books by occult theorists, treatises on Norse mythology, and even self-help books imported from America. Each discovery added another piece to a puzzle no one wanted to finish. As the crates filled with fragile pages, American intelligence began to realize they weren't just preserving books, they were preserving evidence of ideology. These volumes were more dangerous than any weapon. They offered glimpses into how a man could twist knowledge, philosophy, and faith into instruments of tyranny. Weeks turned into months as investigators traced the scattered remains of Hitler's possessions. In the attic of a Munich apartment building, they found more boxes sealed with wax, each labeled in German cursive, Führerbibliothek, the Führer's library. Another cache was discovered near Salzburg, its shelves warped by moisture but still standing, the titles legible beneath mold and dust. Some of the soldiers whispered that even after the war, the books seemed to radiate presence, as if the spirit of their owner had never quite left them. The Monuments men documented everything, photographing the covers, labeling the crates, and sending them to secure storage. Yet even as they handled each fragile volume, an unspoken question hung in the air. What were they really touching? Artifacts of history, or remnants of a mind that had nearly destroyed it? For the Americans, this mission became more than preservation. It became an act of confrontation. To understand Hitler's power, they would have to look directly into what had fueled it. Every underlined sentence, every folded corner, every personal seal became part of a psychological autopsy of one of humanity's darkest figures. By the time the last shipment was prepared for transport to Allied headquarters, the soldiers no longer viewed the books as simple spoils of war. They handled them with a strange reverence, a mix of fear and fascination. It was like holding a mirror, one officer would later say, a reflection of what happens when thought turns to fanaticism, as trucks rumbled down the Alpine roads carrying the crates toward American custody. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky blood red. Few of the men spoke. They knew this was not the end of the war's story, only the beginning of another one, because inside those boxes lay something far more revealing than battle maps or orders. Inside lay the evidence of how an idea became a weapon, and how the written word, once meant to enlighten, had been twisted into a blueprint for darkness. And as the convoy disappeared into the night, one chilling thought echoed among the soldiers. If these pages built a dictator, what will they reveal when the world begins to read them? The crates were finally opened in a quiet corner of an American military archive, far from the smoldering ruins of Europe. The smell of dust and age filled the air as historians, linguists, and intelligence officers carefully removed the fragile volumes one by one. They expected propaganda, pamphlets about Aryan supremacy or Nazi strategy manuals. But what they found instead stopped them cold. These were not books of war. They were books of thought, titles that spoke of art, architecture, mythology, philosophy, and even psychology, bound in worn leather, some with gilded edges, others with the Nazi eagle embossed on the spine. But what? Fascinated and unnerved, the researchers most were the markings inside. In the margins, Hitler had written his mind. Some annotations were neat and deliberate, others scrawled in a rush of emotion. Certain phrases were underlined with such force that the paper had nearly torn. Next to passages about leadership, destiny, and racial purity, his initials appeared: A. H, written in a sharp, confident hand. Each page, each note, felt like a fragment of the man's consciousness captured in ink. Among the first books examined was a heavily worn copy of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Entire sections about the Übermensch, the superior man rising above morality, were marked in pencil. To Hitler, Nietzsche's words were more than philosophy. They were prophecy. He twisted the idea of human transcendence into justification for racial domination. Nearby lay another book, Darwin's The Descent of Man, its margins filled with exclamation marks, beside paragraphs about evolution and natural selection. The Führer had treated Darwin's theory not as science, but as scripture for his ideology, a justification for his obsession with purity and power. But not every book fit the image of the ruthless dictator the world knew. There were unexpected titles that defied the caricature of Hitler as a man of only hate. Volumes on architecture and urban planning, pages covered with sketches and calculations for his dream of a new Germany, an empire of monumental stone and marble. Books on art and classical sculpture, filled with admiration for Renaissance masters he both idolized and stole from. Even books of mythology and the occult, underlined at passages about divine kings and ancient bloodlines. In one strange volume titled Magic, History, Theory and Practice, he had annotated paragraphs describing how ancient rulers used ritual and symbolism to command the masses. To the investigators, it was a chilling revelation. Hitler wasn't simply collecting knowledge. He was curating the very mythology of his own divinity. And then came the books that shocked even the most stoic officers, works that criticized him, mocked him, and condemned the ideology he had built. A French translation of Mein Kampf, covered in handwritten rebuttals from anti-fascist scholars, had been carefully preserved in his collection. Hitler had highlighted their critiques, adding sharp notes in the margins as if in argument with his invisible enemies. One page bore a single line underlined 3 times. The German people are blinded by their myths. Next to it, Hitler had written in the margin, "No, they are awakened by them." It became clear that he didn't just want to silence dissent, he wanted to understand it. Every opposing viewpoint he encountered became another weapon in his intellectual arsenal. There were also books from America, works by philosophers, scientists, and even self-help authors that had made their way across the Atlantic. Titles like The Power of Positive Thinking and How to Win Friends and Influence People were tucked among volumes of war history and racial theory. Historians debated what he sought in those pages. Was it strategy, manipulation, or simply a perverse fascination with the democratic world he despised, yet secretly studied? Each discovery drew the investigators deeper into the contradiction that defined him. A man obsessed with knowledge, yet enslaved by ideology. A reader of genius, yet a servant of delusion. As they catalogued the books, the Americans began to realize something horrifying. This was not a random collection. It was a blueprint for a worldview, a self-constructed mythology of intellect turned evil. The books didn't just reflect what Hitler thought. They revealed how he thought. One intelligence report described the experience of reading his annotations as like peering into the eye of the storm. Hitler's notes often turned from intellectual reflection to pure emotion, rage, bitterness, and a near mystical belief in destiny. His library was not a quiet refuge, but a battlefield of ideas. In one volume on Norse legends, he had circled a line describing Odin's sacrifice to gain wisdom. Writing beside it, "Sacrifice is the proof of greatness." In another, a text on military leadership, he underlined passages about fear and obedience, adding, "They obey not the man, but the symbol." Every phrase showed a mind not merely influenced by books, but consumed by them. Historians pieced together a chilling pattern. Hitler had drawn from Nietzsche's philosophy, distorted Darwin's science, stolen from the occult, and borrowed from the aesthetics of ancient Rome, all to construct a personal religion of power. His empire was not just built with guns and tanks, it was built with words. Ideas reforged into weapons. One scholar later wrote, "In those margins you can see his evolution, from reader to believer, from believer to fanatic." But perhaps the most haunting realization came when investigators found that many of his books had never been fully read. Pages remained uncut, their corners untouched. The dictator, who claimed to be a student of knowledge, had at times been more in love with the symbol of intellect than with intellect itself. He wanted to be seen as a man of culture, a philosopher king, but the deeper the Americans looked, the more they saw how shallow his pursuit of truth truly was. Still, the library remained terrifyingly intimate. Each volume, each note, was a whisper from a man trying to make sense of his own darkness, and as the archivist turned the final pages, a chilling thought began to form. Perhaps the key to understanding Hitler was not in his speeches, nor his conquests, but in his bookshelves, a labyrinth of ideas that revealed both his brilliance and his madness. What they didn't yet realize was that this discovery was only the beginning, because hidden among those annotated pages were notes that pointed to something darker still, books that spoke not only of power and race, but of prophecy, and those would lead investigators to a revelation they were not prepared to face. The deeper the investigators went, the stranger the atmosphere around those books became. It was no longer a library they were exploring, it was a labyrinth of obsession. Page after page revealed not a scholar's curiosity, but a fanatic's search for proof. In several volumes, Hitler's handwriting grew erratic, feverish. Lines underlined again and again, margins filled with symbols, arrows, and strange shorthand. He wasn't simply studying these books, he was interrogating them, demanding that the past itself confirm what he already believed. The first real shock came from a thick, black-bound tome titled Magic, History, Theory, and Practice. Its cover was worn smooth from handling. Inside, Hitler's pencil trailed across nearly every page. He had highlighted entire sections about ancient rituals used to inspire obedience through fear and spectacle. Next to a passage describing how kings cloaked themselves in divine mystery, he had scrawled, "The Führer embodies fate." That single line sent chills through the researchers. It wasn't strategy, it was revelation. He wasn't trying to learn how to lead. He was convincing himself that his rule was preordained. Other books revealed the same hunger for validation. Treatises on racial pseudoscience contained intricate notes linking blood purity to moral strength. In one margin, next to a chart of skull measurements, Hitler had written, "Evidence of destiny." These weren't observations, they were affirmations. Every word he read became a mirror, reflecting the myth he wanted to believe. Historians began to understand that these books were not trophies of conquest. They were artifacts of faith, the sacred texts of a man building a religion of himself. Each annotation was a prayer to his own delusion, proof that he saw his rise not as political, but as cosmic. The room where these discoveries were analyzed grew unnervingly silent. Even the most rational minds felt a weight in the air, as if the pages themselves were alive with the echo of madness. It became clear that Hitler's library was never about knowledge or understanding. It was about confirmation, a desperate, obsessive attempt to make the universe agree with him. In the margins of those volumes, one could trace his descent from thinker to believer, from believer to prophet. His handwriting, once measured and disciplined, became erratic, manic, and by the final pages it was almost unreadable, like the voice of reason itself had been consumed by faith. Standing over those open books, the investigators realized the truth that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Adolf Hitler didn't just believe he was leading Germany, he believed he was fulfilling prophecy. And in that moment, the line between intellect and insanity vanished forever. The war had ended, but Hitler's presence lingered, in ruins, in memory, and now in ink. After the discovery of his personal library, hundreds of volumes were packed into crates and loaded onto U.S. Army trucks. Each box was labeled in bold letters, "Property of the United States government." But to those who carried them, it felt like handling something much darker. The convoy rolled across the remnants of Germany, then crossed the Atlantic, bringing with it not just paper and bindings, but the psychological residue of a dictator. When the crates finally arrived in Washington, D.C., they were sent to the Library of Congress, where archivists began the careful process of cataloging and preserving them. At first, the librarians didn't quite know how to treat the collection. Were these relics to be locked away? Or were they evidence, testimony of how knowledge itself could be corrupted? Some refused to touch the books without gloves. Others admitted to feeling an almost physical discomfort when they opened them. One archivist would later say, "It was like handling something alive. You could feel him in the pages." As the cataloging continued, the Americans began to notice strange patterns. Many of the books bore stamps with the Reich's eagle insignia and Hitler's own nameplate, but it was the handwriting that unnerved them most. In the soft lead of a pencil, the Führer had left behind trails of thought, crossed-out words, emphatic underlines, and comments that blended arrogance with awe. Historians and psychologists soon joined the effort, poring over each marked passage. The notes were not random. They revealed a man constructing a mental framework where violence became logic and genocide necessity. In a book on social Darwinism, Hitler had underlined the phrase, "Nature knows no compassion," adding beside it, "Neither can a leader." In another, a text on ancient warfare, he drew boxes around lines describing total destruction as a means of purification. To the scholars reading them, it was a terrifying intimacy. They weren't studying a faceless monster anymore. They were confronting a man who believed himself justified by reason, history, and nature itself. Every annotation was a confession, every underline an echo of a mind rationalizing evil. For the Library of Congress, the collection became more than a historical curiosity. It became a warning. Stored in climate-controlled rooms, guarded by layers of security, the books were catalogued not by title, but by their danger, the danger of ideas left unchecked. Over the years, only a handful of researchers were granted access. Those who did described an almost spiritual heaviness in the air. The margins, once simple notes, now read like whispers from a ghost, one that refused to be silent. The Americans realized that they hadn't just preserved the dictator's possessions. They had preserved his intellect, his twisted logic, the very mechanism of his self-deception. What they had taken home was not merely a library, but a mirror, a reflection of how the pursuit of knowledge without empathy can spiral into catastrophe. And as the final crate was shelved deep within the archives, one librarian closed the logbook, hesitated and murmured softly, "Some books are meant to be read, others only remembered." Outside, the world had moved on, eager to forget. But within those walls, surrounded by the words that once guided destruction, America kept its quiet vigil, guarding not just history, but the evidence of humanity's most dangerous mind. For decades, Hitler's personal library sat in silence, sealed in climate-controlled rooms beneath the Library of Congress, its existence known to only a few scholars. Time dulled the memory of its discovery, and for most, the story of those books faded into the footnotes of World War II history. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. It was the early 2000s when a new generation of researchers began sifting through neglected archives, cataloguing forgotten materials from the post-war years. In one corner of the library's rare manuscript section, a staff member came across a stack of unmarked boxes, their contents long since removed from circulation. When they pried them open, the sight took their breath away, leather-bound volumes bearing a golden insignia, Ex Libris Adolf Hitler. The forgotten collection had re-emerged. Word spread quickly through the academic community. Historians, linguists, and psychologists requested access, eager to reopen a chapter of the war few had truly understood. Inside those books, they found more than the expected propaganda or Germanic myths. They found a map of Hitler's mind, a record of how one man consumed, distorted, and reassembled human knowledge to fit his nightmare vision of the world. Among the volumes were plays by Shakespeare, annotated in German translation. Hitler had underlined passages about betrayal and power in Julius Caesar and Macbeth, leaving cryptic notes about leadership and destiny. There were also books by American industrialist Henry Ford, whose anti-Semitic pamphlets, The International Jew, had deeply influenced Nazi ideology. The pages were worn from reading, certain sentences underlined so heavily the ink bled through. The deeper the researchers went, the more unsettling the range of his reading became. Works of Greek philosophy, occult mysticism, and pseudo-scientific racial theory sat side by side with children's fables and architectural blueprints. It was as though Hitler had tried to gather the entire history of human thought and twist it into a single, poisonous doctrine. One historian described the experience as walking through the ruins of a mind built from contradictions. Another called it the intellectual autopsy of evil. But what truly disturbed modern scholars was the precision with which Hitler had curated these works. He didn't read blindly. He sought authors who reinforced his worldview and discarded those who challenged it. He wasn't consuming ideology, he was constructing it. Like a chemist mixing volatile elements, he blended Nietzsche's philosophy, Darwin's biology, and Ford's hatred into a formula that justified genocide. In one rediscovered book, Race and Soul by German mystic Alfred Rosenberg, Hitler had written, "This is not theory, it is truth." That small, furious note encapsulated everything the researchers had come to realize. Hitler didn't merely use these books for reference. He believed them. The rediscovery reignited a global debate. Can knowledge itself be dangerous? Could a mind so immersed in learning still descend into barbarism? Scholars argued over whether Hitler's readings revealed intelligence corrupted by hatred, or whether they proved that intelligence without morality becomes monstrous. News outlets covered the story, drawing public fascination. Images of the stamped Ex Libris plates appeared in headlines. People were captivated and horrified to see that the books that once sat on Hitler's desk were the same books found in homes, universities and bookstores around the world. For the first time, it became clear just how deeply Hitler's intellectual reach had extended. He had drawn not only from German thinkers, but from British playwrights, American businessmen, ancient mystics, and modern scientists. He was not isolated in his ideology. He had built it from fragments of the very culture he sought to dominate. As one historian put it, Hitler didn't burn all the books. He read some of them, and that may have been worse. When the last of the rediscovered volumes was logged and sealed once more, a heavy silence settled over the archive. The researchers stood surrounded by knowledge that had been twisted into justification for atrocity. The lesson was painfully clear. It wasn't ignorance that fueled Hitler's evil, it was selective understanding. And as they closed the final cover, one question lingered like smoke in the air. If knowledge could drive one man to destroy the world, what does that mean for the rest of us who still seek to learn from it? The books sit in silence now, preserved behind glass, their pages yellowed by time, their spines cracked from the hands that once turned them. Titles in German, English, Latin, works of philosophy, poetry, science, and superstition. Together, they form the ghost of a mind that tried to reshape the world, and almost succeeded. When visitors walk past those shelves today, most see relics of evil. But for historians, they are mirrors, showing how even intellect, when consumed by obsession, can decay into delusion. Hitler was not an uneducated monster. He was a voracious reader, a thinker, a man who sought meaning in the written word. But instead of finding truth, he carved his own reflection into every idea he touched, until the knowledge itself became corrupted. That's the quiet terror behind those books. They remind us that knowledge isn't inherently good or evil, it's what we bring to it. The same pages that once inspired philosophers to dream of human progress were twisted to justify cruelty, genocide, and control. As the camera lingers on the stamped mark, Ex Libris Adolf Hitler, the question hangs in the air like smoke. If the world's most educated tyrant could twist knowledge into darkness, what does that say about us, the readers of today? Every book we read, every belief we adopt, shapes who we become. Hitler's library stands as a warning that wisdom without empathy, curiosity without conscience, can destroy as easily as it can enlighten. The shelves close in shadow. The whisper of turning pages fades, and what remains is not the story of one man's madness, but a reminder of our own responsibility to think, to question, and to never let understanding be consumed by hate.